Our next seam sample that we're going to do is to create a gathered mini skirt or sleeve, a gathered piece with a binding. So we're going to start with our normal sized square sample and a smaller little sample that we'll use for our binding. For this gathering stitch, we do 2 rows of straight stitching, but they both have a really long stitch length. So we're going to increase our stitch length, which is this button here that has the straight line, to the max that it will go, up to 5. Now we also need to be able to pull our threads once we've finished sewing. So I've just pulled these out a bit extra so that they are long and you don't reverse stitch with this at all. So this is just a single piece of fabric. We're not doing right sides together or anything. So just along one edge, I'm going to put the presser foot right on the edge of my fabric, and we're going to stitch without reversing a straight stitch all along that edge. Now it's important again to make sure we leave lots of room for our stitching. So you can see here that it creates a really large stitch that makes it really easy to pull through. Okay, now it's time to do our second row of stitching. So we move our threads to the side and we line up our presser foot, the right edge of it, with the straight seam that we just sewed. And remembering to keep our thread ends long. So we have 2 rows of stitching like this that are large. Now what we now need to do is separate the top threads from the bobbin threads. So I'm just using my snips to kind of separate them. I'm not cutting, I'm just using them to help. So that you can see I've just now got my top threads on one side and the bobbin threads on the other. And I'll do that on the other side as well. Okay, now that I have separated both my threads, I'm going to use the bobbin threads and hold them still. I'm not really pulling that. I'm actually moving the fabric onto that thread. So it can break if you are too forceful, and denim's quite strong, so you do have to be a bit careful. I feel like I can't get too much more gathering out of that side, so I'm going to put those threads back down here and go to my other side, getting my bobbin threads and doing the same process from that side. So that it kind of looks like this. Now it's not perfectly gathered at the edges here. I'm going to try and get it a bit more. It can be hard to gather the edges of the fabric. Okay, so that's pretty good. Looks a bit messy at this stage. Now what we then do is with our little binding piece is put it right side together. I'm going to actually do it from this side. Might just trim these threads. Not the gathering threads, just leave those. I was just trimming loose threads. And you're wanting to line up your gathered edge with your binding. I'm just going to put a couple of pins through. And I'm just trying to keep it as straight as possible because there's always a tendency for anything that's gathered to curve. So I've got all my pins at right angles so they are easy to take out when I'm sewing. Now what I've got to do is come back and change my straight stitch setting to the normal setting. So I'm just going to press clear, and that has reverted it to 0 and 2.5. Now what I'm going to try and do is stitch in between those two lines of gathering. So that should line up with our 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. It should do. So I already take the pin out, but I'm already just going to straighten it up. You can see I'm just taking my time with this because I want my gathers to remain as gathers and, oh, not like that, not turn into a pleat. So I've taken my foot off the pedal so that I could kind of just fix that up. So that should look like this. So now what we want to do, we can still see that bottom row of gathering is unpick that. Might be easy to do that from the back. You can sometimes actually just pull it out, but it's snapped. Okay, so now we've unpicked the bobbin thread, that just comes straight off. So now we've got kind of the skirt of our gathering and our binding. Now what we want to do is fold over our binding edge about 1 centimetre and then fold it over again to cover our gathering, to line up kind of like you see here. So I'm going to just pin that in place because we're going to top stitch that from the top. If you were wanting to do a waistband or a bind like this but didn't want visible stitching on the top, you could easily do a nice hand sewing invisible stitch back on the back here. But for this sample, we're just going to do a top stitch across the top. As you can see, I have actually pinned in line with where I'm sewing. So you do have to be more conscious of pulling the pins out as you go because they will jam the machine up. So I'm just double checking from behind, and you can see that this has already got a tendency to kind of curve out. So I want to make sure that that goes up and covers it. So I'm going to put an additional pin in there. So you can imagine if this was a whole big skirt, this would take a lot of time just to set that up. So I've pinned all along my edge here. Now I'm going to just continue to use a straight stitch. I'm going to put the edge of my presser foot along the waistband seam here. And I'm pulling the first pin out before I begin sewing. And I'm only going to do a couple of stitches before I take out my second one. And I'm going to take out my second pin. And so it looks like this. And from behind, it looks like that. We could do an additional seam right on the edge here and edge stitch it to make it even flatter. But for our samples, that's okay. It shows how to do this.